There is probably no one more qualified in the state to introduce our fireside chat guest than Ellen Meacham, who is a longtime instructional assistant professor in our journalism school at her alma mater, Ole Miss. She is the author of Delta Epiphany, Robert F. Kennedy in Mississippi. She was also selected as one of the 20 journalism professors in the entire country as a fellow with the American Association of Newspaper Editors. A native of Tennessee, she is a longtime resident of Mississippi and is uniquely positioned to write about the South. She has a master's degree in the interdisciplinary program of Southern Studies from this university. Her work has appeared in the New York Times and USA Today Online. She's been featured on Hardball with Chris Matthews on MSNBC, now MS Now, the BBC, Ireland's News Talk Radio, Newsmax Television, Marketplace with Kai Risdall, and on numerous other public radio shows around the nation. Please welcome Ellen Meacham.
Thank you, Steve. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy for the opportunity to get to introduce our guest today. It's such a lovely day to talk about such an important topic. Y'all let me know if you can't hear me. So I've spent much of my career doing what journalists do, which is write the first draft of history, focusing on the here and now. But over the years, I've found that I could not escape the fact, which of course Shakespeare told us a long time ago, that the past is prologue. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and without understanding the context of an event, it's hard to evaluate its relevance. So before I tell you about the many accomplishments of our guest today, I'm going to tell you a quick story. So 60 years ago last month, a group of law students here at the University of Mississippi challenged an oppressive campus speaker approval policy and stood up to enormous pressure from state officials, the chancellor, the institutions of higher learning, and invited Robert F. Kennedy to speak here on campus. Now, March of 1966 was just 4 years after the deadly violence surrounding the successful enrollment of James Meredith, the first Black man to attend the university. And you have to understand, in Mississippi at that time, Kennedy, who had been Attorney General during the riots, was widely considered the villain of the story. And you should also know at that time that most Mississippians lived in what today we would consider a filter bubble, with local news outlets that were frequently one-sided, wildly racist, and who often censored news and viewpoints that countered the prevailing segregationist point of view from state leaders. In short, much of the state news that Mississippians saw in those dark days was untrustworthy. And this was a key factor in the violence that erupted on campus in 1962. Now, in 1966, Robert Kennedy was well aware of the animosity and, frankly, hatred that was routinely flung at him by Mississippi newspaper columnists and politicians. But after some careful consideration and a little trepidation, he accepted. And then, from the moment his plane landed at the Oxford airport to his, and frankly, everyone's surprise, he and his wife Ethel were met with a warm and enthusiastic welcome everywhere they went. In fact, demand for tickets was so high that officials had to move the location twice, finally deciding that it would be the first public event in the newly built Tad Smith Coliseum, later nicknamed the Tad Pad. That day, with humor and warmth, he spoke to wild applause in a packed house, telling students, "Your generation, this generation, cannot afford to waste its substance and its hope in the struggles of the past. because beyond these walls is a world to be helped and improved and made safe for the welfare of mankind. But more importantly, and to the point of this symposium, as he took questions from the audience, he single-handedly burst the filter bubble around the events of 1962. He took questions and answered them with frankness and clarity, acknowledging his own mistakes, while also revealing for the first time the actions and the behind-the-scenes double-dealing that then Governor Ross Barnett had been doing with the Kennedy administration during that crisis. This bombshell, which made headlines across the state, ultimately helped doom Barnett's chances for another term as governor. And Kennedy left that day intrigued by the energy and possibilities that he had found in Mississippi's young people, something that factored into his next visit to the Mississippi Delta a year later, and in 1968 as he contemplated running for president. So as we gather today here, the changes that communications technology offer, they offer so much potential and exciting opportunities to hear new voices and fresh ideas and work together to solve our problems. But we still face a lot of the same problems. We still have plenty of people in their own news filter bubble, acting on misinformation, sometimes violently. We have officials who love the idea of controlling what we say in the classroom and what our students hear and who gets to speak on campus. And perhaps most concerning, we have a current news ecosystem that too many people believe they cannot trust. And without reliable information about a shared reality, it is nearly impossible to work together to solve problems, which is essential for a government by the people in a representative democracy. So with that in mind, we're so pleased to have our guest today, former Congressman Joe Kennedy III, on campus to talk with us about those issues. And yes, he does happen to be the grandson of Robert and Ethel Kennedy, but he is so much more than that. From 2013 to 2021, he served 4 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District.
Not bad. Thank
That's
you.
good. From 22 to 24, he served as the United States Special Envoy to the Northern Ireland. While in Congress, he built a legislative record around economic policy, health care, and civil rights. He sat on the House Energy Commerce Committee and spearheaded bipartisan efforts to extend mental health coverage, support domestic manufacturing, protect consumer voices, make hearing aids more important, which I'm starting to need to think about a lot more these days, and defend access to legal assistance for struggling families. He serves as president at Citizens Energy, a nonprofit energy company founded to help low-income families meet their basic energy needs. And he is also founder of the Groundwork Project. He serves on the board of the Woodwell Climate Research Center, Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, Massachusetts Association for Mental Health, and the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. Went to Stanford University and Harvard Law School. He was in the Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic, and he lives in Boston with his wife and 2 children. So we are so happy, and please welcome him.
Thank you.
So one of the first things that I wanted to talk to you about is someone who's served in Congress, who's spent time working in campaigns, talking with other people, other public service roles, and as a member of a family that attracts frequent media attention, for better or for worse. What do you think is ensuring the public's access to a trustworthy news? What's at stake for us?
So a lot. And first off, just thanks. It's wonderful for me. It's a treat to be back here in Mississippi. My first time to University of Mississippi and Ole Miss. I was told when I asked some folks for advice, they said, don't mention LSU. So whoops, I guess. But uh, thrilled, thrilled and honored to be here, truly. I'm sorry I just missed a good friend of mine, Adam Kinzinger, whose office was across the hall from mine as when I was a lowly freshman and he was a sophomore. We served on several committees together, Foreign Affairs Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee. And as you would imagine, we didn't agree on everything, but I gotta say, he was somebody that was from the beginning willing to put country and his beliefs in front of basically anything else. And I think we need a lot more of that these days across that spectrum. So I'm glad you had him and think very highly of him. And then just thanks for calling attention to this issue. There's a lot of bemoaning the fact that we are, our democracy is kind of tenuous at the moment, and our society is getting pulled apart, and we are part of that. This isn't something that's just being done to us. We all have an active role in that, unfortunately. But there's less talk about like what do we have to do to actually do something about it. So really just applaud you all and the university for hosting this important discussion. With regards to kind of what's at stake, like everything. And I say that not to be hyperbolic, but I mean, at least from my perspective on things from somebody who served in office, and you know, I think a skill that I didn't realize I needed until later in a career was like, it's storytelling. I was a prosecutor for years. Trials are stories. Campaigns are stories. Nations are built on narratives. They're stories that we tell each other that connect different people together off of a common story, a common thread, common values that animate and connect to us as a collective. And so what happens when we no longer believe, have that same set of facts, have that same narrative? Those bonds start to fray and they become untethered. So we could label that as democracy in terms of like the fracturing of a political system. But really what it is the pulling apart of the ties that bind us together, which I think is almost even a graver threat, but linked obviously to issues of democracy. And so, you know, like being more concrete about that, I guess, Professor, like government legitimacy. And I think we've seen that writ large. If you do not believe that your representatives, the people that are your voice, either in Jackson, Mississippi, in Boston, Massachusetts, in Washington, D.C., have the legitimacy of having won an election, then anything they do is going to be seen as illegitimate, right? You're supposed to have won, and with that victory comes the imprimatur of legitimacy to be able to act on the mandate of the people. If you don't believe that people gave you that mandate, then everything you do, to me, like you don't have the right to do that. You shouldn't, even if it's something I agree with, you shouldn't, you do not have the legitimacy in order to effectuate that decision. That cascades to voters in society. If you don't have basic information, if there's no agreement on the same set of facts about what is coming out of government, then one, how do you hold folks to account? How do you allow candidates to skirt that accountability, skirt that responsibility, focus attention someplace else, and I think breeds the opportunity for more performative politics rather than saying, hey, we can disagree on tax rates. You're forcing me to make an argument as to why I think they should be lower or why I think they should be higher in order to serve a policy outcome for the country. If we can't get to that point where we're having a legitimate debate on those tax rates or whatever the topic might be, but instead, what I know is going to get your attention is just going right into questions of identity or outrage or clickbait that is going to get you to follow me and follow that attention, that just ultimately creates greater kind of polarization and a pulling apart, again, of that fabric of our society. And that's what I think you are seeing in Technicolor today.
That's right. Well, what are some things you've worked with media? You've had media around you all the time. What are some things that news organizations should do less of or stop doing? I don't know if you want to offer a prescription, but if you had some suggestions, maybe.
I mean, I love the fact that, like, it is the first time. I'm sure I had to be out of office for this. I wish somebody asked me that when I was in Congress. Like, what could the media do better? Like, I got a long list, right? I got a long list. So look, I think I do have some ideas for that. I want to be as honest and as fair as I can be about this, of saying it's one thing for me to sit up here as a former elected official, as a diplomat, as former diplomat, as a member of a family that, yes, gets a lot of attention, and much of what is written about that is not accurate, right? Which is in and of itself a kind of a separate but related topic. But it's easy for me to criticize without acknowledging a business model that has been gutted from what it was when 15 years ago or so when I was coming up in politics, and I had 4 local newspapers, and the Boston Globe didn't really pay much attention to me, but there was governors and senators and big other races to focus on. But I had 4 local newspapers, and my job was to show up in those 4 local newspapers every week, and that's what we did. Those news desks are gone, so it is easy for me to kind of cast some like, hey, I wish you do more of A, B, and C and less of X, Y, and Z. But if the economic landscape does not allow for that, it's not really all that helpful for me to make that prescription. That being said, you asked the question, so here we go. Look, I will say one thing is the clickbait, revenue is driven by clicks. And so, yes, I understand the fact that media has to engage in, follow the news and make those headlines grabby. The challenge of that is like not everything, CNN, Fox News, everything is breaking news. It's not all breaking news. It just isn't, right? It's not breaking. Some of it is, most of it's not. So that 24-hour news cycle is exhausting. It's hard. I do think, my own political perspective here, I think this administration likes to have breaking news after breaking news after breaking news. But I would love to see media institutions, to the extent that they can, separate what is actually breaking news and the news of the day. And look, some stuff coming out of Washington on either side of the aisle here, like you have to cover, and you do. But there's the stuff that you have to cover that is like surprising or is going to be of interest. There's apparently a 250-foot tall arch that the president wants to build in front of Arlington Cemetery. That is a newsworthy thing. Is that as important as to what is happening in the Middle East today to society? Probably not. Is as important as what's happening with regards to the impacts of a major tax cut whose impacts we started to see yesterday or on Wednesday? Probably not. Is it as impactful as to what's happening to our healthcare sector across our country at the moment? Probably not. How do we separate kind of the attention-grabbing news of the day that has to get covered while also saying there are longer-term issues here that do not drive as much clicks, but in terms of what is needed to inform a society about the impacts of what is happening to us, these issues are far more important than whether an arch is going to get built and whether it's 250 feet tall or 75 feet tall or how much taller it is than the US Capitol, right? Like, look, I still read the story too, but.
Right. So what are some things that they could do? That kind of the flip side of that is you're talking about looking at impact and actual effect on audiences and what could they do to rebuild that trust? Because first you've got to get people's attention. But to rebuild trust, first you got to get people's attention, and then you got to make them feel like it's relevant to them, and then they've got to feel like they have to. That if they did something about it, it might actually make a difference. And so what are some ways that you think maybe the media could do some things that could connect with people? What do you hear from people to rebuild that trust?
So I think, look, trust building is hard, but there's some basic principles to it. And again, not all of this can be possible given the pressures of a financial model, but we can kind of dive into some of that, more of that in a second. I do think that, like, yes, you need to get people's attention. But one of the things that I used to do when I was in office, and I still do from time to time, just because I found it fascinating. This crowd probably has it. You're familiar with the museum, the Museum of News that was so. When there were major national headlines, right? Impeachment scandals, impeachment, Mueller's testimony in DC, major issues that kind of dominated political narrative. I would always go to the museum because there was a tab there where you could see headlines from around the country. And they had something like 700 or 350 different headlines from that country. And I would remember looking at the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, or looking at the news feeds that I would receive that I thought were important for me to be kept up on the national news from Washington. And then just like flip through, what does the local newspaper, what are they covering in Biloxi? What are they covering in rural Alabama? Just like show me, I know what I'm consuming. What are you consuming? And one, you realize that a lot of the front pages end up being the same. Why? Because smaller newspapers have been gobbled up by private equity-backed firms. Two, it was like literally three things: traffic, crime, and football scores. But if you think of it, maybe not this year, right? But it was a healthy dose of reality to me of saying, if this is like, if you're in Washington, D.C., if you're at a cell corridor between Boston and New York in Washington, D.C., you are thinking that this is the most consequential thing of a lifetime in politics. And the vast majority of folks that like might have that on in the background for some portion of the day, but like trust that local newspaper, they're not even really reading about it. So how do you, to your point, Professor, translate either that to them or them to you? And so I think like the most crucial thing on this is translating, understanding that where trust is built, it's built locally. And as trust is fractured, there's distrust of anything big at the moment, anything big. But who do you trust? We still trust, like, I trust our kids' schools. I might disagree with some aspects of this, but like my kids are in this place. And like, if I don't trust it, if that trust is fractured, I'm going to move them, right? But like, there are local trust builders that we all put faith in. And they might be different, but pastors, teachers, coaches, there are pillars of society, community builders. And so I do think for local news organizations, using those folks also as barometers, as sources, as voices of a community so that you can get that feedback, but then ask them to convene a group of folks so that you can hear from them and you can talk to them and you can get that feedback and ask the question, what do you think of us? How can we rebuild that trust? I will also say, the press doesn't always get it right. I am so grateful for free media. Yes, 100%. The press is fallible, right? There's an entire industry, as I think everybody in this room knows, around spinning different narratives to reporters and trying to make sure that they buy one and they don't buy another. I remember, because I'm Irish, we never forget the grudges. I remember on one of my campaigns, there was a line in there from a newspaper in Massachusetts that just took the thing ended on the quote from my opponent's campaign manager about me. And I was like, well, that's what he said. That's not necessarily true. Right? But that's what it is. So like, okay, where's the accountability for that? If you're going to convict somebody on page A1, don't acquit them on C24. And if we're going to screw up, acknowledge that, because like there are mistakes. But oftentimes when the press gets caught somewhat in that mistake, it's not, hey, on the front page, this reporter made a mistake, they've been suspended, or they've been this, or they've been that, and there's a correction on a story saying, oh, by the way, on the updated story after the thing's already gone out. That's not full accountability. So can you build in accountability metrics? Can you engage those local voices? And then I do think you've seen more of this with the advent of and the use of technology. I do think it's fascinating to hear how some of your reporters and sources build a story. There was a fascinating piece last week that I read from Jonathan Swan and Maggie Haberman about the decision for President Trump to launch the strikes against Iran. Both of them sat down, they granted anonymity to, it seems like 1,000 different sources, right? Which in of itself was quite something. But they both sat for an interview about how they built that story. That to me was also fascinating, saying, how did you get all of these sources? Can you tell us about some of those? What can you tell us about some of those sources? Because this is a big story and a big deal, but I am trusting you because you're not putting names behind it. So I'm putting my faith in you that you are doing this with the appropriate level of integrity and fact checking and ethics to have that credibility. Now, in my perspective, those two reporters, I respect greatly. They've earned it. But I think it was still important that they sat down and did it so they could open themselves up to that and explain, for a story that has potentially as big a consequences as that, here's how we did it. And I think that's helpful.
I'm really interested in that and from your perspective, because it's something I say to my students a lot, that it concerns me. I think for too long, those of us in the journalism business, we sort of just, and I think a lot of institutions are sort of realizing this, we sort of assume that everybody understood why they were important, how we did what we did. And so when I teach occasionally I'll teach a 100 level course where, one of the first things I do is give them the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. And I had a student a few years ago say, I don't think this is really real anymore. I think this is really old fashioned. I don't think anybody does this anymore. And I was so glad he said that. And I have them write a reflection, and I frequently have them talk about, I had no idea this existed. But you know what? You know who came up with the Society of Professional Journalists' first code of ethics? Students. It was a student chapter at a university. I'm blanking on where they were, and it's 100 years ago this year. But I do think sometimes we don't explain, well, what happened? How do we get this story? How did this mistake get made? Why did we make this decision to leave this in or put this out? And I think that is something that builds trust with audiences and helps people who are being interviewed understand the sort of the rules of the game, so that they're not as trepidatious, perhaps. If you understand how a story is going to be built, I would assume, but I'm asking, is that going to make you feel more comfortable about maybe talking to that reporter because you've seen, like you talked about how they built the story?
It depends, right? Yeah. And the dynamic, I think, between public figure and reporter is, on the one hand, I want that to have a good relationship. For most serious reporters, I want to have a good relationship with them. I think they want to have a good relationship with me. Some of them, particularly now, don't. They're just trying to get you on camera to poke you, and again, that's the performative nature of it, which is a shame because it degrades everything. But like, they're trying to buddy up to me, and I'm trying to buddy up to them, so that I hope that they're going to not, whack me as hard as they might, and they're trying to use me as a source for something. So like, there's this odd dynamic of kind of transactionalism that just infects that world. I think, for those very serious reporters, I know like they're going to write what they're going to write. They're going to ask the questions they want to ask. The best I can do is like treat me fairly in that. And if you don't, then, there can be ramifications for both of us, but like treat me fairly through that. I do think that, the reporters also have reputations, and the greater the reputation that reporter has, amongst people they cover for being fair and objective, and again, serious, like the better. I learned when I was in office, like it's less, I would read, and still do, a fair amount of publications. I read journalists. I don't read the publications, right? There's certain people that I read because if that person's written something, I want that perspective. It doesn't mean I agree with all of it, but there are people that know certain topics very, very well, and I want to know what their sources are. Very, very good. And if David Sanger's writing a piece on national security, I want to read it because he's probably going to have something serious to say about it, right? If Maggie Haberman's going to write something about the White House, I probably should know what they're saying, right? If Ruben's writing something on tax policy for the Journal, like I'm going to learn more out of that column than I am about on a lot of other columns. So who can I read to get best informed on some of those on those topics? That's, I think.
So building relationships, either personally or just with your readership, even if you're not knowing those things, it sounds like an important step.
The relationship obviously matters, and that's how trust is built. And it's built by being honest and the accountability. There was a issue years ago with one of our local newspapers in Boston where a prominent reporter got accused of some wrongdoing, was let go. There was never an accounting of that on any aspect of the written paper. Just all of a sudden, that reporter was no longer working there. Some of us that read that newspaper every day and knew that reporter all of a sudden realized that like the byline was gone. But it is somewhat surprising that like, hey, if somebody did something bad enough that they got fired because of some aspect of their professional work, and there's no transmission of that in any professional way to the readership, that like you violated some standard big enough badly enough that we had to terminate your position, but we're not telling the readership that there was an issue. Like, I don't know, man, it feels to me like you're hiding that ball. You certainly wouldn't let me do that.
Good point.
So this is the kind of catch-22. The press that kind of fourth estate are the umpires of our political system. There is, from somebody that gets judged by those umpires, that I view you as like, you're supposed to be calling balls and strikes. You don't get every call right, but if there's no, if we're asking you to police yourselves, there does have to be some level of accountability for that to build up kind of faith in that entire system.
Well, I think that kind of brings me to another question I have, that we have a system that in large part relies on citizens making informed. I mean, it's a beautiful belief that people can make choices about how they are governed, rather than having it come top down. But what they need is reliable information. And so, but we have, and that's kind of what is struggling. That piece of it is what is struggling. Like you said, it's fundamental to all of the other things. So if they're going to be making decisions about how they're governed, and the news climate increasingly rewards sensational, outrageous, or one-sided infotainment, as someone who's worked in policy, who's been a lawmaker, are there some policy approaches that might bolster quality journalism without running afoul of the First Amendment? Like keeping.
Yeah, so obviously, obviously the First Amendment's a big one, right? So look, I get skeptical of the idea that, and the power dynamics here are real, right? If you have some, some writ large source of government funding saying, okay, here's direct funding for local media, well, it becomes a little bit more difficult for that local media necessarily to hold government where the funding's coming to account, because if that money is appropriated to the local mayor's office, then, and I can cut that out of your budget the next cycle, like, are you really going to be critical of that local mayor or not, right? Like, we have to be careful of those incentives. That being said, I think there's a handful of things that definitely should be considered. One, we have not quite as robustly funded anymore, but a corporation of public broadcasting, right? So there are ways to fund. We have a National Science Foundation. Both of those institutions have been targeted recently for, because of a perceived view on their kind of politics. That being said, setting up, modeling something where, some source of funding that goes into a pot that has then pushed down locally, overseen with independent directors to be able to fund local news or local outlets, like that's something one to consider. Two, government subsidizes all sorts of different industries, right? Is there a way to put a tax credit in or incentive in for local news, local newsrooms, employment, local newsrooms? Is there an incentive that could be put in place for people to subscribe to local news and local news outlets, right? That's another option. The other, which I don't think often gets linked in this story, it's just kind of accepted as like, oh, well, that's too bad, is the fact that what's degraded that news model is the internet, because the internet has been able to take all of the advantage around precision advertising behind behavior and geo-targeting and everything else, and have basically none of the obligations that newspapers have because of Section 230, right? Like, these platforms can put up whatever they want. Doesn't matter if it's a lie, doesn't matter if it's defamatory. They have a shield because they say we're a platform, we're not a publisher. Newspapers can't do that. Local news outlets can't do that. And yet you also can't target advertising nearly as acutely as obviously internet companies can. So not only can government do something here? Yeah, government can do an awful lot. We can look at this in terms of like the funding side of things and tax incentives. You can also look at this of saying, hey, there's a big debate about whether the repeal of Section 230 is, good policy or not. Without wading into that, are there other policies to look at to say what we have allowed to happen? Like, it was a policy choice to allow the incentives to take hold that have gutted local news organizations and have led to a lack of trust in our society. That was the result of a policy choice. There might be a lot of money that's made by that, but does our system then want to make another choice that says we understand that this might not initially lead to as much capital investment or money being made, but are there ways here to strengthen that trust that can also lead to other business and economic opportunities that that doesn't put economics at the kind of at the cost of pulling apart our society?
Great. Well, I would like to ask you one more question and then maybe get to some questions from the audience. And so our country and world is facing some serious challenges, and this industry is facing some challenges and require a shared sense of reality to solve them. So what are some things, there's a lot to be concerned about, but what gives you hope? What are some things, I'd like to end on a hopeful note.
So, we got challenges at the moment. No doubt, no question. I also think that I think I think those challenges are real. I think they're systemic, and I think like they're going to take a lot of work for us to work through. From my perspective, like this is not an easy thing that we're up against. That being said, what is also not covered by the media, because there are very few local media outlets anymore, is the fact that there are people that are knitting communities back together, that are building, that are healing, that are supporting one another, stranger and neighbor alike, happening in almost every corner of our country, and they never get any credit, they never get any stories, they never get highlighted, they just do it in silence. I started this organization, Professor, you referenced Groundwork Project. We support local civic organizations around the country, Plains, Deep South Appalachia. We're in Alabama, we're in Mississippi, we're in Oklahoma, we're in West Virginia. I was in Oklahoma last week. One of the grantees we support is the small little group out of Norman, Oklahoma, called the Red Dirt Collective. What do? They help. Like, that's what they do. Mutual aid organization. What does that mean? They do like town fairs. They show up on stuff. They show up local places, county fairs. They do kind of whatever they can. Food pantries, fixing bike tires. What do? Whatever it is that some community neighbor needs. If they need something, they can call these folks and they will try to find a solution to your problem. They do it on a shoestring budget. They have next to nothing. They've got like a Facebook page and that's it, because they don't have a website, because they don't have the money, but they just help. One of the more powerful conversations I've had in a while was a couple years ago. I was down in Biloxi doing some work with the NAACP, and we came into this. Friends where I was with took me to lunch, and we pulled into this old, I think it was an old high school, and there was like, we were there a little early. There was nobody there yet. There was 4 ladies behind the cafeteria, and they turned the lunchroom into a restaurant. And it was the best lunch I've had in probably 15 years. It was, you guys do catfish a lot better down here than they do up there, I'll tell you that much. It was probably a 30,000 calorie meal, and it was incredible. But this guy comes over, a couple years older than me, comes over, says his name's Jeffrey, and he wanted to show me something. He said he was the local state representative from the area, and he had something to show me afterwards. So finish up my lunch, have enough sweet tea to try to like get my sugar level up after the food coma, and walk across the street. And it's June in the Gulf, and it's hot, and it's way too hot for me. And we walk inside, and there's a couple of what I presume are grandmas and a whole bunch of little kids. And you could have heard a pin drop in that place. I got 2 little kids. You can never hear a pin drop in our house, right, Freddie? And I go, what's this? And he goes, it's a summer camp I run. And I'm like, well, how do you run a summer camp? And he said, look, I grew up here. I went to school, I think in Texas. I can't remember which one, on a football scholarship. I was 19 years old. I got caught smoking pot, and they pulled my scholarship and kicked me out. And I had no idea what to do, and I joined the Army. Spent 30 years in the Army. Came back home, is doing community building work, and found that in Biloxi or Gulfport in the middle of the summer, like kids need something to do. And he said, half these kids here, their parents work 2 jobs and they can't care for them. And the other half, they need something to do. So it started summer camp. So it's grandmas from the community, and we come in and we just take care of the kids. I said, well, where do you get the funding? And he said, well, I'm a part-time state rep, and so we get some funding from the legislature, and I pass the hat in the community, and whatever I don't raise, I write from my military pension. Well, sir, how much does camp cost? He goes, 25 grand, depending on how many field trips we do. When I was in office, I would do a lunch for 25,000 bucks for a campaign. He's putting kids through summer camp for 25,000 bucks and writing it out of a military pension if he can't raise it. Like, what gives you hope? That guy.
That's great.
And there's these people all over this country that are doing this. And, you know, he's not saying, you know, are your parents Democrat or Republican? Did they vote for me? Did they not? Like, what do you think happened on January 2nd? Like, it's just, you're a kid and we're helping you. And like, we're going to take care of a kid.
Yeah.
So like, take care of a kid. Like, that part ain't hard. Take care of a kid.
Well, that's kind of segues into some of the one of the first questions I wanted to ask, because it's from a student, or I assume it's a student, a 21-year-old. It says, perhaps I'm viewing the past with rose-colored glasses, but it feels like that today much of the decency that public officials once held is all but gone. I go on X/Twitter and constantly see communications that feel unbecoming of what would be expected. Can you attribute this to a specific reason, movement, larger tonal shift? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so like a lot to unpack there, and great question. And it's I'm sitting on the board of a organization at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and this is one of the things that I've kind of focused on there, which is if you're 19 or 20 years old, 21, and you care about current events and care about politics, look at politics as I hope you would, which is a way to help solve a problem, right? Government is people sitting around a table trying to solve a problem. That's all it is supposed to be, just solve a problem. Then in the past 10 years, if you're 20, if you've been paying attention for 10 years, you are a far more engaged and decent human being than I was when I was 10, right? But if you've been doing that, you've been coming up in a age that has been probably the coarsest, most degrading narrative we've had ever in American society, right? And so what you see on X, and I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on X, is the first thing I would tell you, right? It's just it does not, people talk on those platforms the way they never, they talk on that note, they would never speak to a neighbor, excuse me, the way that they would speak to somebody that they get on those platforms, and the distance of anonymity just brings out the worst in humanity. So what is it? It's social media, it's accountability, it's attention economy, it's clicks, it's all of these things, it's outrage. It's also not real. And chances are a lot of the likes that you're getting from those posts also literally aren't real people. They're bots. And so it is a massive distortion of actually the decency that we see across society. When the hurricanes hit, Hurricane Maria and Irma hit Texas, and Houston was flooded with feet of water, people raced to help their neighbors, people they never even met, people they didn't know. They weren't asking again, are you, who did you vote for? Are you a Democrat or Republican? Or do you believe in X or Y or Z or whatever else? What church you belong to? They just helped. So do I think, has the dialogue changed? Yes. Has it been have the people in power modeled this appropriately? Absolutely not. Is that painful to me? Yeah, it is. Is there a way through it? Yeah, it's also a collective choice. One, don't spend as much time on the platforms that are toxic, right? Make conscious choices not to fall down that doom loop. And candidly spend more time, I would hope, modeling the folks that are building. And, maybe Mr. Jeff down in Biloxi and Gulfport is spending some time on X, but he's trying to figure out how to put 100 kids through summer camp. So I bet you he's not spending a ton of time on X because he's trying to do that. So do that.
Great. So another one from a student that I like, a freshman public policy student says, how do you convince people to care about journalism or the news when so many are not? And I have a figure here that I was going to mention. The recent Pew poll said that 80% of U.S. adults, 80% of them said it's important to stay informed, but then 48% of U.S. adults said they see no relevance to their lives in the news. So his question was, how do you convince people to care about journalism?
So this is one of those interesting questions where in political life still, I'll get this question of, oh, there's no difference between the parties. But yeah, there is, right? The one thing I don't think you could say these days is there's not a difference between the parties. There's a very big difference between the parties. And I say that by saying you like one side and don't like the other, fine. But there's a difference between the parties. So if folks are saying the news isn't relevant to me, then I would say, well, one, find a different news source, because just because the news isn't relevant to you doesn't mean that irrespective of what you think the news is saying, things are being done in your community, and they are being done to you whether you pay attention to them or not. And so if there is no longer a local outlet, if there is no longer a local newspaper, if there isn't opportunities to try to call attention to it, one, you actually can do that. Why? Because you've got a phone and you can put yourself on a platform, and other people, if you're feeling that way, chances are other people in your community are feeling that way too, and you can actually start to be one of those trusted voices. We are also seeing, you mentioned, Professor, a little bit earlier about some of these ways to try to institute faith and trust in local media. Philanthropy is filling a bit of that role. The American Journalism Project is helping to fund local newsrooms. They've done an incredible job with Mississippi Today. Mississippi Today won a Pulitzer Prize recently. I went to Mississippi Today a year and a half ago, maybe. It's a couple of senior journalists and like 24 graduates from Columbia School of Journalism that got fellowships that are reporting on what's going on in Mississippi. We don't have a local outlet like that in Massachusetts doing it. We got the Boston Globe, which is great, but that's Boston. They don't have the resources to do that across the state. So if you're saying that there's news that isn't relevant, I would say to you, chances are, one, that means, power whores a vacuum at any level, whether that's economically, whether that's politically, whether that's, some sort of commercially or economically. If you are not aware of what is taking place in your community, somebody might be trying to take advantage of that. So if you can't find that news source, start asking around, sit down with a local pastor, sit down with a local teacher, sit down with a local coach, 3 or 4 of you have a conversation every Sunday, Saturday, post that up, have people that you trust come in, talk about what's going on. You will all of a sudden be the local news network. Why? Because people want to know what is happening in their neighborhoods, in their schools, with their kids, what they need to do. Don't let somebody else do that.
I'll have another question that's a little more policy. What are your thoughts on limits to media ownership? Limits on media ownership.
Yeah, so we are seeing mass consolidation across a whole bunch of different industries, right? Whether that's airlines, whether that's now movie studios and larger production hubs and media writ large. The consolidation and concentration there, I think, should be a concern to anybody. That is to say, one, the perspective, if some of the conglomerates there have a particular political viewpoint, that viewpoint can change, those executives can change. Having a robust, having a platform for or a marketplace for different ideas to come through, I think is by far the most important piece. And I say this from somebody that, like, my job when I was in the House of Representatives was to try to build consensus. Did I get a whole lot of consensus from the representatives from Mississippi? Like, no. That's okay. Like, that's fine. The people that I was working with, I served in the Space Committee for a couple of years. I had good conversations about space and stuff with representatives here. Why? Because you got Stennis here. And it turns out that when I was sitting there trying to figure out, like, NASA funding for the guy from Boston was like, I don't know, we don't have a big NASA facility here, but we like engineering. We want some of that research dollars going to MIT and Harvard and whatever else. And like, I don't know, like the Kennedy Space Center is like a good thing. So like, what else can we fund? How can we promote NASA? So we've got a bunch of great partnerships from the Mississippi delegation there. Great, that's your job. Find the things you can work on and like work on that. But the idea here is not that you're going to live in a country of 340 million people that all agree on something. How boring would that be? We don't. That's a beautiful thing. What you just want is a place that those ideas can bounce around, that you can debate these things, that you can have a discussion about what is the right fit for your community in Boston versus your community in Oxford. And they're not going to be the same, and that's okay. But then I don't really want to have a perspective of a viewpoint that is driven by society, a community based in Orange County or, rural Texas, dictating what's happening in Boston, the same way that when I took a cohort of my Republican colleagues up to Boston, it was look, this works great for you. We just don't want you implanting that on us. Fine, deal. Right? But then let's call that part of truce and let's go on.
Okay, well, we've just got a little bit more time, but we've had 2 questions related to AI and trust. And one is about responsibilities and options for journalists in the wake of AI with news and images. And then how you think that usage of AI generated content contributes to public distrust.
So look, I think we're all figuring this out, right? I will admit, I used to be in a role where I had to give a whole lot of speeches. I don't have nearly as big a PR team as I used to have. Claude can do a pretty good job, right? Like that takes that work from like a half a day to like, okay, like I can do the rest of this in an hour and a half of like, but you saved me 3 hours here. So like, thanks, Claude. So there are obviously enormous gains to be had from this. There's enormous danger that is coming from this as well, right? The use of AI generated images, and where we are, the government can come nowhere close to keeping up with the rate of progress here. There used to be, some of the young folks in the crowd will remember that old adage of pics or it didn't happen. Now it's just pics and it might have happened, but it also might not have, because you can generate a pretty good deep fake video at the moment and have me doing or saying something horrific that I just didn't do. But you can now probably do it well enough that it would be on me to refute it. The one good thing on that is like the general public is now going to sit there and be like, we don't know if that's true. So it's not that you don't necessarily trust everything you see, it's just that you don't trust anything you see. I was talking, Professor, with a friend that knows this stuff far better than I do. And their perspective was actually interesting because it was the first time I had heard it, was saying this is going to boomerang around where all of a sudden it's going to create a marketplace for arbiters of truth that actually can do the research and have the credibility to say, this happened, this didn't. This is fake, this didn't. And I was like, you mean like journalists? And it's like, yeah. But that people will be willing to pay for it. Because if you don't know what's happening in your community. You don't know if this is real or not. And so and it's getting so sophisticated, I need somebody or some entity with the tools to be able to discern, is this faked or not? And government obviously has to be able to step up here to say, if you're going to be running campaign ads or whatnot, you have to put disclaimers on there for stuff that is AI generated. And there is going to have to be, I think, liability for some of these platforms or whatnot. If you start to knowingly put forward stuff that is blatantly fabricated of public figures or whatnot, where there's real damage, like, what is the recourse for them that gets, for somebody that gets harmed, so badly in that way?
Well, I think that's about, are we getting close? We have one more question. Well, let's see. Well, we have some good ones. We sort of cover the ethics. Hold on, let's see. Let's see if there's anything else we haven't. So this is a question about the prolific use of anonymous sources. You've kind of touched on that. And someone else is, when did you notice the decline in trust? Like, when did you start to notice that people, that the
look, there's the
trust in journalism, and what do you think triggered it?
I don't think there's one thing that triggered it. There's always been conspiracy theories out there. Some of them have been easier to write off, but one that stuck with me, and I was actually thinking about this on the flight down here. Some of you remember this Jade Helm thing, Special Forces thing from 2015? There was a Special Forces operation training operation that took place in 2015. Some of you can Google it. That was coordinated a bunch of different branches. I think it was a Joint Special Operations Command training operation to try to simulate a defense training, or it was a defense training program across like 6 states for a couple of weeks back in 2015. And it got leaked out that there was one of the maps in this simulation, right, that was put out there, had Texas, I think Utah, and I guess New Mexico labeled as enemy territory. And so it then went around saying Barack Obama is going to try to use special operations to invade Texas. And you're like, well, hard to invade Texas, one. Two, like, it's a training exercise. Governor Abbott nationalized the Texas National Guard to monitor the operation, because he said that he was concerned not that SEAL Team 6 was going to actually engage in seditious activity, but that they would be duped into engaging in seditious activity at the request of Barack Obama. But the governor of Texas actually did that. Right? So when you sit there and go, like, where's the lack of trust? Like, part of this is like the political incentives on this are bananas. Like, Alex Jones put this thing forward. Right? And then it was you're going to kidnap people, literally, take them to a Walmart supercenter, to have a tunnel underneath and like repatriate them to ship them off to Mexico, which is interesting because now we just pick people off the street and do that anyway, right? But like that's where we were at. And it was advanced by a prominent governor in this country. So I'm not saying that to try to pick on Governor Abbott. I am saying that to say this is something that on the one hand, we all bear responsibility for. On the other hand, it's hard to point the finger necessarily at anybody. But there are actions that we collectively can take that actually can build that back up. And my answer to one of the I think one of the students earlier about as people distrust, it is very hard to understand what your federal government is. Most people aren't going to meet the president of the United States, regardless of who he or she may be. They're not going to meet. Most of them aren't going to meet their elected officials. You don't know what's going on there. You don't see it. You don't touch it. You know it has some impact on your lives, but the direct impact might be hard to discern in that immediate basis. School boards matter. Local elections matter. Taxes matter. Water quality matters, right? Having some local contact and local accountability, even if it is just 4 or 5 people sitting around a table reporting on what happened this week in your local town, like that's where this, from my perspective, is going to boil back up. And that's what we need to incentivize. Because people do need to trust something, and they do trust what they can see, what they can touch, what is proximate to them. That's where it starts. And so we all have an opportunity to do that.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. And
Thank you very much.